Hello. I suppose technically it's the afternoon, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest in Ruud Pedersen's series of climate talks. We all delighted to welcome so many of you back, and grateful that you're making time in your schedules to take part. Just flagging up the next webinar in the series. So Tuesday next week, Tuesday the 7th of April, the next webinar will be with Elena Wisnar-Malinowska. She's a head of unit in DG Klima, dealing with international issues and adaptation. So it's a chance to have a different look at climate change, obviously the adaptation issue, rather than the mitigation. So we're all looking forward to that. Looking backwards to the events that we've had, we know that there's a lot of interest from you in listening and watching back. So we're pleased to announce that last week's seminars are available on YouTube. Those of you who registered and participated will have a link, or we'll have a link that will enable you to access it for a week. And then after that, we're going to make them publicly available. And I think you can also, if you click on offers, is that right? You can offers on the right-hand side. I think you can find the link. If you have any problems, just send us an email. We'll be more than happy to help. Great. So for today, our guest is Barry Lynham. Barry is Managing Director of Knauf Energy Solutions. And Barry's company provides large-scale data-driven energy efficiency solutions for the building renovation sector. Obviously he's going to talk about how the Renovation Wave as part of the European Green Deal fits together. Our other discussant today, I'm not going to do a long introduction, is Peter Vis, and Senior Advisor Peter Vis. Joanna will be the question writer, and been doing a great job on feeding up your questions. And also,
Simon, you have an issue with your microphone.
Yeah, and we'll also read out the poll, read out the poll results. Okay, so before we start the discussion, Joanna, could you bring up the first poll? Is that on the screen? Let me just have a look. Okay, great. So we want to start off with asking you out there about those of you who actually taking renovation seriously and have thought seriously about energy efficiency and have spent some of your own money in improving energy efficiency. So we'll leave a poll there for you to vote on, and we'll come back to that shortly. We wanted to kick off today's webinar with a sort of scene setter from Peter, just sort of explaining for those of you who may not know the existing EU legislation, how it affects the buildings and renovation sector, and maybe some of the thinking behind that before we come to Barry to sort of tell us about how his company is doing and some of the other sort of current and future issues. So, Peter.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. Good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to introduce with facts about the European Union's legislation with regards to energy efficiency, and in particular for buildings. First of all, buildings, both commercial and residential, use 40% of the energy consumption of the European Union. And of course, buildings use energy through their needs for heating, for cooling, for lighting, and for appliances. Now, there is in the European Union a target for energy efficiency, which is to improve energy efficiency by 20% in 2020. And this target is a union-wide target. It's not applied individually to the member states. And the fact is, we're not on track to meet that target, which has been in place for over 10 years. And what the European Union has decided to do more recently is that there will be a higher target set for 2030 Again, it's a union-wide target, and we're striving to improve energy efficiency by 32.5% by 2030. So basically those targets are problem targets insofar as the European Union is not on track to meet them. However, there are a number of legislative initiatives, directives, laws, in other words, that are enabling efficiency improvements across the EU. But there's also principles and plans. One of them is a principle of energy efficiency first, and a plan to indicate one is the national energy and climate plans. But of course, it isn't principles and plans that get us there. It's measures. It's implementing measures. In terms of measures, we've got a directive for the energy performance of buildings that was updated in 2018. Its focus is on new buildings, and the headline target is that by 2021, all new buildings will be nearly zero emissions buildings. And then there is in that directive also a renovation target for public buildings of 3% per year. But these are public buildings that are owned by or occupied, used by central governments. So it's a target, but it's a very constrained target in its scope. Another important directive is the Energy Efficiency Directive. Again, it was updated in 2018. What that does, the main headline measure of that, I would think, is that the energy distributors and suppliers are obliged to achieve an average annual savings of 1.5% of energy sales per year through to 2030. And that measure is the key measure, if you like, within the directive. It's estimated that it will contribute half of the achievement. Is it efficient? That's a question we're going to debate, and I don't want to sort of do more than that now. Okay, stop, and we have a debate about it.
Great, thanks, Peter. Now, Barry, before we get into the sort of regulation and the legislation, obviously the thing that's foremost on everyone's minds is the coronavirus, and I expect that's having a very large effect on your industry and your company. Can you tell us what's going on at the moment?
Yeah, sure. I think the construction industry is really the pulse of the economy. So when the economy goes down, obviously we see major impacts on the construction industry. You do still see sites going on within the limits of what's being allowed by European governments where it's safe to do so. So it's not that activity has come to a complete grinding halt, but obviously when you see these major downturns in the economy, the construction industry follows that, and obviously it's going to be a challenge for the industry over the next couple of months, particularly if the confinements stay for longer and people can't get back to work.
Right. Okay. Good. So Peter's given us an overview of the existing regulation, the way that affects directly or indirectly sort of the scale and the pace of renovation. But as Peter pointed out, we're way off the targets. What do what's your assessment of what's in place now and what the sort of level of ambition is in the European Green Deal? Because I was looking at it recently, and I have to say I don't see any sort of new hard and fast targets that will really drive the renovation wave, as we're calling, as it's being referred to. So what's your assessment?
So I think that as Peter alluded to, I think that the new build has been very well managed by the current regulatory environment. I think the new build sector is going in the right direction. Some member states could certainly tighten up their near zero carbon standards, but I think across the board it's the right direction. I think the big challenge is renovation. It's really where all the buildings are, right? With 1% annual new build, the major part of the building stock that will still be standing in 2050 when we need to be zero carbon is the existing building stock. And I think what we've seen so far in renovation has been quite, I think, to learn level, quite weak. And I think it's the area where we really need to up our game. We need to see a lot more activity in terms of how the EU looks at the renovation side. And I know with the Renovation Wave, they're proposing that. But I think if this isn't the time for ambition, Simon, when is? I think, this is the industry, which is, I think it's 92% of all construction companies are less than 10 people. So when you're thinking about post-COVID-19 and how we get money down to the bottom of the economy and getting the economy started from the bottom up, the construction sector obviously is a critical opportunity for that, and renovation and driving the zero carbon transition and the just transition will be critical for that. So I think it's not that what's being proposed so far is wrong, but I think it lacks a lot of ambition. I think we should be looking at some much bigger ideas and some big flagship initiatives on renovation, which could drive us out of this crisis today.
But why has there been this level of ambition? Because it seems, at first sight, renovation seems a win-win. I mean, you reduce energy consumption, you reduce emissions. It creates jobs, as you say, in the construction sector. It's I assume it's relatively labor intensive. You would have thought it's an obvious route to go down, and yet it's sort of the orphan. It's the poor cousin in the whole climate strategy priorities. Why is that?
So one of the views that we certainly have at Knauf Energy Solutions is that one of the big challenges energy efficiency has been to prove the actual energy efficiency and the savings that have been created. When you look at sort of production of energy, it's very, very clear that when a government, for example, decides to build a major power plant or a large offshore wind farm, that the actual energy that's produced is metered day after day, and you know what you get. And therefore, if you set hard targets, you know if you get there. I think energy efficiency has for a long time suffered from the fact that it's really been hard for us to be that precise, and therefore to allow governments to treat energy efficiency like we can treat energy. And I think what we've tried to bring to the market with our ability now to measure energy efficiency and to meter it as accurately as you can meter energy production changes that paradigm. And I think it gives the opportunity to governments in the EU to rethink energy efficiency and actually be a lot more ambitious in the way they look at it.
Okay, before we talk about what your company offers, Barry, can I bring Peter in as a former policymaker and sort of put the same question to you? I mean, it seems like a no-brainer. It seems such a sensible use, and I would have thought going forward an obvious priority, and we've seen open letters going from parts of the industry to MEPs, and there's obviously a vigorous debate now about the Green Deal and the timing and so. But it just seems such a non-brainer to spend money in the renovation sector. Why has it been the poor relation?
Well, I think one issue is that the target is set at the European Union level. And admittedly, there's a reluctance by the member states to have targets imposed on them individually. And so the latest idea of making energy suppliers and distributors responsible is a way of passing the obligation a little bit to the private sector. And so that I would question whether that is the best model to follow, because those energy suppliers are trying to sell energy to final consumers, and then we're asking them to essentially sell less energy to final consumers. So it's a little bit contradictory. Of course, energy companies could move towards renovation services and things like that. Perhaps there are profits in that avenue, and certainly it's to be pursued. But I think the truth is we need more binding obligations in the implementation in the directives that we have, of which we can discuss possible ideas. But I think there is, if you like, what the model we've got clearly just isn't performing as well as we need it to perform. Everybody thinks that energy efficiency is a good idea. Of course, there are some barriers, like the fact that energy efficiency requires upfront financing. You have to have some cash to do the measures, and then the payback period is obviously over time. And you'll do that in your own house, but you won't necessarily do it if you're renting a house. And the proprietor, quite honestly, isn't the one paying the bills. So these are the sorts of barriers we've got to really focus on.
So Barry, okay, so clearly there's been we haven't used the full potential of renovation, but okay, so your company comes along. What are you offering that's different that might sort of unlock the spending? to really
Yeah.
take advantage of the potential?
So I think two things, Simon, I think that are really important. One comes to the barrier question, which Peter kind of just alluded to, but let's say we've brought to the market using, IoT capabilities and cloud computing capabilities.
That's Internet of Things, yeah. So
And the ability to measure as accurately the energy efficiency created by a renovation as you would do by creating a power plant or a wind farm or anything in terms of the power side. And that makes a huge difference, because actually governments can now say to themselves, okay, rather than just paying for measures, they can actually pay for performance. They can say, for example, I want to buy a 1 gigawatt saved energy virtual energy power plant, virtual energy infrastructure, which has never been possible before. And that lets them say, I'm going to go out and I'm going to say, okay, I want to renovate 400,000 homes and deliver that gigawatt of power. And that comes to the barrier question, because when you can turn that on the side, what you're going to do is you're going to create European champions that people like us would love to be, where we're going to go and sort those barriers out. So it's interesting when we talk to wind farm manufacturers or people who do large solar arrays or people who do power plants, you don't hear them talking about barriers and cash problems, and they just go and do it. And I think the reason is because they integrate into one organization the capability to deliver these large projects. And we've never had that on energy efficiency. So the second thing which we try to bring together is that integrator capability, right? That one-stop shop energy efficiency service provision, which if you could back that against government requesting large-scale retrofits to deliver saved energy in a measured way, so the actual, the paying for the performance, you could think about actually, I think, really getting the renovation wave going in a way that's never been possible before. Because those barriers would just be the typical things that we as industry should be good at knocking down. If we have the counterparty, which is like the power industry has had, which is long-term rather than power purchase agreement, things like long-term power savings agreements, which I know California has been experimenting with. And so I think there are some very innovative ways we could think about policy. We could deliver that huge increase in renovation, which governments want, but have struggled to get. And I think we're trying to bring those things to the table.
We're going to come back a bit to sort of the policy framework debate, but just a bit more on the technology. So, I mean, presumably what you do goes beyond smart meters, but is that one element of how your service works? What do you call it? It's a service, right? Or what do you call it?
So it's a one-stop energy efficiency service to our customers. So we take care of the entire opportunity. But what we do, which is very, very different, is we can tell you exactly the energy efficiency improvement that's been made, which really changes, for example, the bankability of projects. So why is it reasonably easy for power projects to get financing up front? Because they have the same problem, right? You have to build a power plant day one and you get paid over many years, is because they have a very bankable flow of capital, of capital coming in post
return.
You can do the same on the energy efficiency side. You can also do the same. And that's one of the things that we bring to the table is this capability. And yes, I mean, there's lots of areas where you could already do that quite simply, but the place where it was really hard to do it is in single family residential, because at the moment of change of a house, you often change the people. So often renovation takes place when you buy a house. It takes place when you maybe you're moving into retirement and you're changing your behavior, or when you're getting children. So your old energy bill so a smart meter isn't enough to really know whether you've got the energy efficiency change that you pros. And what we bring to the table is the ability to really tell you the change in the fabric and the change in the house. What is that delivered? And what are the actual savings going forward? I say, which really, I think, for our view, changes the conversation, because it now makes projects much more bankable, much more integratable, and you can start looking at large scale projects, kind of like those kind of big European kind of flagships like we've done in other areas, to really create the European champions and capability to deliver the renovation targets we have to deliver.
Okay, and I mean, the thing that occurs to me is that I come from the UK, where people move house, buy and sell property very often. I think the average is 7 times in a lifetime. But there are other markets where you just don't have that level of turnover. I mean, I remember saying to a Belgian friend, in fact, it was Jos Delbecker. I said that I'd lived in 7 houses in my life, and he was as a Belgian, he was staggered because Belgians live in their parents' house and then their own house, so you don't get that turnover. But I mean, turning it around a little bit is, so you're on the market with this solution, but it sounds again like an attractive proposition. So why hasn't it taken off just by being an attractive technology? I mean, we're going to have the results of the poll in a minute, but why haven't you been able to just sell it on its own merit?
First of all, we've only been going for a year, and
right. Okay.
We are selling. We do have projects, and they're doing well. I think the other reason is because we've always said that there are kind of 4 M's to this topic, and we say you have to be able to measure, right? And we kind of solved that question of being able to measure. The second thing you have to be able to is mine energy efficiency, by which means you need to be able to actually deliver real projects that deliver real energy savings cost effectively. And again, we've put that capability in place to be able to do that. The third thing you have to do, though, is monetize those savings. And policy takes time to catch up, right? So the policy measures in place today, whether it's the energy obligations on energy companies or other types of subsidy schemes and support schemes, have been based on paying for measures, not for outcomes. And we believe that is one of the things that really stops the market from going correctly. And it's one of the things that we think that now that we have this opportunity, we should be looking at ways so actually we could start to support people who deliver performance outcomes rather than just the measures. I mean, you can't just move from one world to the next overnight, but you need to start that process, because we think that's what has the opportunity to kickstart this market and get to the 3% renovation rate, and it's deep renovation rate, right? Remembering that the current real deep energy efficiency rate is probably around 0.2, 0.3, not 1% for deep energy efficiency renovation, to like a 75%. And we need to get to 3%. Is a huge, huge challenge the European Union has. And if it doesn't do it, it won't meet its climate objectives. So it kind of has to do it. It's got to figure it out. And I think what we're saying is that big piece which has been missing has been that monetized piece. How can policymakers rethink the way they support this area, much more like they've supported in the past the development of new technologies on the power side, to do the same one and to really go out and build what we call virtual energy infrastructure.
Okay. I think we're going to go to the polls in a minute, but Peter, do you want to come back on any of the points Barry's made there? Otherwise, we'll go to the poll results.
Certainly, performance is what matters. And I've done energy efficiency improvements in the house, and they've done things to the house. They've put insulation in the roof. And I would love to know what exactly the actual performance is. I don't know whether they did it well. I don't know whether they put enough insulation in the roof or too much. I mean, I don't know. So that would seem okay. Clearly, what strikes me is that the idea of buying on a performance basis, the question then is who would buy? Well, for renewable energy, it is member states who are saying that they will pay a certain amount. They want to buy so many gigawatts of electricity produced by renewable energy, and there are competing bids as to which company might produce that amount of electricity at the lowest price, and the governments take the one at the lowest price. What we need to think of is a mechanism whereby that purchasing of performance is done, and the question is by who? Without energy efficiency targets per country, no member states is going to go down that road, I think. So we've got to think carefully about who it is who actually has the obligation. You could make it property owners. You don't necessarily want to penalize people who rent, perhaps who can't afford to buy, but people who have an asset might have to do this every so often. I think we've got to think carefully about that, because I don't think that asking energy companies to reduce their market share is really going to be the optimal solution.
Sure. Okay, let's continue on that. But maybe should we have the results of the first poll, and then maybe take some questions from the floor if we have some.
So the results of the poll, the question was that if our audience has invested in improving energy efficiency of their houses and their home, and the most popular option, 46% answered yes. I'm publishing the results as well. 32% said no, and only 20% of people said not yet, but I would with better incentives.
Okay, great. So that suggests, yeah, there's a fair amount of scope out there between the people who haven't done anything but who are interested in doing something. That's what, over 50%. Okay, Joanna, do we have some questions from the floor at this point?
Yes, we do have some questions. For example, Clara Hirschman from the Commission is asking that what is the difference in the methodology to save energy efficiency of which Barry is talking about? How is it so much more precise?
Okay.
Yes, I can answer that fairly simply. I mean, I think what the Internet of Things does is allows you to change a fundamental paradigm, which is in the past what we did is we thought we modeled things, right? We said we asked ourselves how do we model an energy efficiency house, and how from that can we imagine? So we think, okay, how much insulation is in the wall, how good is the window? We try to work out what the energy efficiency level of the house is. What we do, and what the Internet of Things allows you to do, is say, well, no, don't do that. The world is its best model. Just measure the world, right? Use the real data that you're really getting from the house and from the activities that you've done. Work with algorithmic approaches to understand that data, and then you can actually not get a model of the house, but you actually can measure the energy efficiency of the house before and after retrofit, and actually have its real efficiency level. That then allows you to understand the difference between the old house and the new house, and understand exactly the benefits the energy efficiency measures have delivered. And then you can turn that into a meter, which is an energy meter or a CO2 meter or a cost meter on what's actually being saved. And I think that's the big difference which this development of sensor technology and cloud computing is allowing, is that you can have this paradigm shift from kind of this modeling, which is often highly inaccurate. And we know the energy performance certificates can be up to 50% inaccurate in terms of what they're looking at, because no one actually knows what's in the wall. As Peter said, he doesn't know whether the work was done correctly. We know it, it's a bit potluck sometimes because we don't have this view on things. So I think that's the big change, right? Is that paradigm shift, which the Internet of Things allows to go from say modeling to actually measuring and letting the world be its best model.
And is that on the measurement? So is it a point-to-point measurement? So before and after, but is there also a dynamic ongoing? Presumably the system is also dynamic. So I don't know whether it helps you switch between different types of energy consumption to get the best tariff, or to use your solar panels, or I mean, presumably when it's in place, it's also dynamic and responding to.
Yeah, so I think you're now kind of coming to what we call the fourth M of this, which is the management of the house. So after you can measure, mine, monetize, you need to manage the house post renovation. So I think it's two separate things. One is the ability to measure the energy efficiency. So what has the infrastructure investment in the house, right? Not how the people's behavior has changed. Was the infrastructure investment you've made in the house changed? And then how post renovation, yes, you can then look at things like managing the house effectively for supporting things like peak load management, or other kinds of of activities in terms of the grid support, or support to the individual homeowner in terms of information support to them. But that's different from the measuring the efficiency, which has been kind of the hard thing to do, right? Was to work out how do you take the people out of the equation and just understand the impact of the infrastructure investment. And that's why we see it much more now like power infrastructure, because you're making an investment in the infrastructure to make it better and more efficient, and taking kilowatts out of the system rather than adding kilowatts to the system. So that's kind of our view.
Yeah, Peter?
Barry, I just wanted to ask Barry, could I retrofit the house I'm in and say to you, I'd like it to be zero emissions house? Please do that. How much would it cost? Could you deliver that, or would it be overreach? Would it be me expecting too much?
So that's a good question. I mean, I think so. Yeah, we could, of course, right? But one of the things that our technology allows us to do is to actually ask the question, which one of the things we know with energy efficiency renovation is that it follows what's called a hockey stick curve. So that the first 50%, 60% of measures to reduce energy are by far the most cost effective. And then you start going up the hockey stick and it becomes much, much more expensive. So if you go today, I mean, hopefully in years to come, technology will improve, it will get further and further up the stick. But right now to go to 100% is often very, very costly. But actually what we see is probably somewhere around 70 to 75%, which is what the renovation rate is calling for in terms of depth of renovation, is quite cost effective. And what technology allows is to say, well, actually, how have we reached that level for you? And what our integrator capability allows us to do is to work with contractors in the building chain to get you to where you need to be. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, in terms of looking at the long-term cost of the renovation wave, getting to that moment in time is really important, because that last 25% double and sometimes triple the cost of the renovation for limited necessary. So I think, so yes, we could get you there, but it's not probably where we should go for the whole of society right now.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know if there's any more questions on the technology, because I wanted to move the discussion. And in fact, the next poll question is about the sort of scalability and the sort of the mass scale aspect of renovation. Do we have any specific questions on the technology, Joanna, that we should ask at this point before we kind of broaden back out again? If not, we can just go to the second poll and then come back to questions later. We will come back to questions later again. There's
questions on financing and policy side, so.
Okay, well, that's part of the next discussion. So could you introduce the next poll at this point, and then we'll let that run in the background while we're discussing.
It's up.
Okay, so yeah, so the question here is really about the scalability of the application of technologies such as Barry's company makes. So let me just start there. So I mean, I'm not far from an expert. I mean, but it sounds, what you're proposing or describing sounds, as I say, a very effective and use of, technologies that are coming together, smart meters, IoT, AI, so on and so forth. I suppose the question is, to bring it back to the European Green Deal, is to what extent are these solutions, really scalable to deliver significant energy savings, and thereby also greenhouse gas emissions savings. So Barry, could you talk about sort of what kind of size projects you're doing at the moment, and sort of your ability to scale up to really and how you would go about that? And then we'll then come back to sort of the policy drivers behind that. So it's a question of, can you do it, and then what would enable you to do it, if you like, from the policy side?
Yeah, so I think we've been set up to do that, right? We're part of a large industrial group, and the whole idea of this organization is to build the basis of an organization that can then scale aggressively. I would go back to, I think, one of the things that Bill Gates once said. Bill Gates said that everyone overestimates what they can achieve in 3 years and underestimates what they can achieve in a decade. And I think that's, if you look at the growth, for example, of wind or solar, you start, of course, the first projects tend to be quite small, right? They tend to be, and then over time they grow. And I know I keep on coming back to this kind of like, see this as power now, see this as the power sector. So as policymakers, ask the question, how did we scale up nuclear 50 years ago? How did we scale up other forms of energy? And I think, look at the same way and say to yourself, okay, yes, probably you'll start with maybe a 50 megawatt virtual power plant, and then move to a 250, then move to a 1 giga power plant.
And when you say virtual power plant, you mean the equivalent as an energy saving?
Exactly.
So
yes.
Instead of building a power plant to produce a gigawatt, you reduce demand out of the system by a gigawatt by.
You renovate 400,000 homes, for example, to take a gigawatt out. So could we deliver 400,000 homes this year? No, we can't, of course, right? Could we hopefully get there in a few years? Yeah, that would certainly be our ambition. And I think, but if I take even a further step back, it's not even a question whether that should be our ambition, because if we want a zero carbon environment by 2050, we have to blow this market open, right? You need to build European champions that can deliver 400,000 homes a year. Now, whether it's us or somebody else is another question, right? I mean, we're putting ourselves in a place to try to be that, but if we don't do it, then we're not going to get there. And I think one of the things this crisis should remind us of is that if we think today things are difficult, if you look at what a 4-degree planet looks like in 2050, when you look at 2100, when you look at the kind of predictions of the problems and issues we're dealing with as a planet, when we get to a 4-degree world, which is what we're currently on target for, this is nothing compared to that, right? So I think it's, from a policymaker, is kind of how do we get there, not whether we get there or why we get there. It's just simply, let's think about how we can get there. And I think, yes, we've set ourselves up to be an organization that could scale, but it's going to always be chicken and egg, right? If governments don't come forward and say, go and build us a first virtual energy power plant, which is a group of renovated homes, do the kind of things that Peter suggested, which is, just like they put out calls for energy production, do the same with power savings agreements for other power purchase agreements, then we won't be able to build the capability to deliver. But we're standing by with the technology, but also the integrator capability to try to scale as rapidly as governments want us to do.
Okay, Peter, on the policy side, I mean, what do you started talking about sort of better policy drivers, but I think, what Barry's talking about, that's not in the European Green Deal. It's largely continuation of existing instruments, which have proved not to be very effective. So, I mean, something else is needed, isn't it, to really make this happen?
There's got to be something in the Renovation Wave initiative that the Commission has said it's going to do in 2020. So ideas and measures and models should, of course, be part of that reflection and maybe part of the initiative. I would argue that they should be. I think the question is how to scale. I think we all agree that if a technology is scaled up, it becomes cheaper. The learning curve is such that renewable energy has become much cheaper because it has been produced at much greater scale and the manufacturers have all got better at it. So how do we get scale for building renovation? That is the question. Obviously, you could say, well, governments should organize that, but governments don't necessarily own fleets of houses. They may have some social housing, or it may be a lower level of governance, a local authority that has ownership of the social housing. And there you can obviously get units of housing together. But another possibility might be for the building service providers like Knauf Energy Solutions and their competitors. They might put together a sort of consortium of companies that could collectively ask for volunteers from the public. I mean, I would like to renovate my house more than I have done. Now, what I do in terms of energy purchases as an individual is I'm part of a group that buys energy in bulk. Those sorts of groups are organizing themselves. I think we need to think about how we can scale up, not just social housing, not just government properties, but also commercial buildings and private buildings. And I think we've got to think imaginatively in that, how to build scale. Maybe other people have got other ideas.
If I can jump in, Peter, for 2 seconds. I think what worked really well in renewables was when NRW in Germany came out with the first ever feed-in tariff for solar, for rooftop solar, right? And they said, we'll pay, we accept there are a number of benefits to society which go beyond the benefits to the homeowner, right? Which is CO2 reduction, air pollution reduction, energy security issues, which we should value stack into one number, which is a feed-in tariff to support the growth of an industry that we're going to need in the future. So
and the feed-in tariff is like an extra, is like a more generous price.
Yeah, and the idea, a lot of countries had a rule which was to try to bring the payment back to 7 years, so that if you invested in that technology, your payment period was 7 years. That seemed to be around the kind of level where you got a lot of take up by the private individuals for it. And I think we could imagine the same kind of policy instrument for energy efficiency, which we've called in the past a feed out tariff. So you pay for the energy that's taken out of the system in the same way, so that actually you leave it to companies to do what we should be good at, right? We should be good at marketing. We should be good at encouraging customers to sell ideas to people, to support them through the process of delivering the energy efficiency renovations. And our kind of view is that is another mechanism which would take you out of the classic, the classic sort of social housing sector, which I think is an important sector for the just transition, but it's is perhaps where things might start, but you should be looking for the private in residential sector, which is the biggest sector in Europe, for things like feed-out tariffs or other mechanisms similar to that. Could be CO2 credits that are available to the person doing the project. That will allow, I think, companies like ours and similar companies to go out and do what we should do: knock on doors and convince people to renovate, and build the capability to do it cost effectively over years. And I think that's the other thing that we shouldn't forget, is that when you move to a pay for performance approach where you're paying for the savings, you suddenly incentivize all of us to reduce the cost per kilowatt hour saved, which hasn't really been there with the measures approach. So you suddenly actually can start getting that curve and getting much more savings at a much lower cost, because government has suddenly put in an incentive structure which pushes the market to do what we should do, which is drive cost per kilowatt hour. And then just like solar did, just like wind did, you get to a point where you should be able to deliver those 7-year paybacks without support, right? But at the beginning, we need to get it going and get the industry sort like you did for everything else. And I think we've never done that for energy efficiency. We just haven't worked like that. But it wasn't possible.
So here comes the sledgehammer, Peter. I mean, in terms of incentivization, there is talk about including buildings in the ETS. Is that the right way to create those incentives, or how would that work?
Right. Well, it is true that the Green Deal communication from the Commission talks about the possible inclusion of the building sector in the emissions trading system. But I think there's a measure that it also mentions that we haven't mentioned, but which is a preferable solution would be to revise the Energy Taxation Directive. The Energy Taxation Directive is something that needs updating, and it applies a tax, and remembering that revenues from a tax can be recycled to those people who need subsidies for energy poverty reasons and so on. So tax is the more simple solution from an economic point of view. But we know that taxes are extremely difficult to agree in the European Union because of the requirement that we have to all agree unanimously that we do it.
Yeah, of course.
And in the past, that has proven to be too difficult. And so the fallback for me is very much that buildings might be included into the emissions trading system. Buildings would have to be integrated in a different way to the system functions at the moment. I think it would, in effect, the obligations would have to be what we say upstream on energy suppliers, and those energy suppliers would in fact have to have allowances for the emissions that are going to be emitted by use of the energy they supply. I think that is a system which, first of all, could be adopted through qualified majority voting, with the European Parliament having a say. That is an easier thing in terms of the decision making, but also the system could be calibrated so as to allow some sort of free allocation to be made to households who are on benefits or in low incomes. Now, emissions trading we had a session on it. Economists will tell you that auctioning all the allowances is the most economically rational way to do it. But there is also a possibility of allocating for free for certain categories of households, I would say, because we must be conscious of the fuel poverty and the just transition dimensions of any measure we take. But I think emissions trading could do it, just as a tax could do it. But I think the tax is going to be harder to agree. Emissions trading is doable, I believe.
Barry, I'm going to come to you in just a second, but I think let's just have the results of the current poll, because the next poll question is about the incentives. So let's, Joanna, could you just share with us the second poll so we can then?
Yes. The results should be visible. So the poll was, do you think renovation could deliver substantial energy savings? And 74% of the audience thinks yes, 21% yes, but only if there is greater public support.
That's it. So that's interesting, Barry. So that sounds like the audience, at least on the webinar, think you don't necessarily need greater public support. But let's open and just one more second. Let's open the third poll because it's precisely on the form of support. So yeah. So here's the third poll. Do you wanna do the honors or?
To read out the poll?
Yeah, I mean, maybe we don't need to read it because it's all there on screen.
But I would say that from the audience, we get a couple of questions about how does the tool...
Yeah, great, go for it.
The question on renewables. So how does the tool enable renewables? And also regards to solar potential being not used in Europe to the extent that it could be. So how do we ensure that renovation strategies make the most of all available solutions to decarbonize buildings?
Do you want to, which one of you wants to speak to that?
I can chip in quickly. I mean, I think obviously one of the key things of our technology is the ability to measure and to meter energy efficiency. We can already meter solar, right? That wasn't a challenge. So we don't bring that to bear. On the integration side, absolutely. When we look at cost optimum packages of renovation for homes, of course we look at the renewable side, because when you're looking at an entire house as a system, you should be looking at those questions. So I think what the renewable industry will see is that as kind of major integrator champions start to exist in the place, delivering these big retrofit projects, of course, one of the key issues that they'll be looking at is the role of renewables, and we already do that. So we don't see that as in any way counter the energy efficiency side. In fact, again, if you look at the targets that we're trying to hit, we need to throw everything at this. This is not about either or, this is about and, right? So, and certainly in our projects, we've recommended on many occasions the use of rooftop solar, for example, solar thermal, looking at issues, a lot of obviously requests for looking at things like heat pumps and how they can play a role. So yeah, it's why you need to build that integrator capability to actually deliver the whole suite of energy efficiency measures and renewable measures to housing.
Okay, we'd open the Pandora's box about including buildings and, let's say, renovation buildings in the ETS. What's your, is that something you want, Barry, or is it something that frightens you, or?
So I think I'm not a specialist like Peter is on how the ETS works. I mean, I think there's a couple of points I would make. One is that it's important to find a bankable flow of capital which you can use for supporting upfront finance, right? And what we saw with renewables is that obviously governments are a very good bankable partner for banks to go against. They're very low risk, and therefore you can get long-term capital at low prices, right? Typically 20, 25 years at below 3% if you do the structuring correctly. So you facilitate energy efficiency amazingly if you have that counterparty, which can be either fully paying for the retrofits or paying a part of the retrofits, and then the energy savings pay the rest. So it's not a either or, it's about finding the right sort of area for that to happen, just like it was for solar. On the question that you asked, Simon, about if can this happen by itself? Well, what I would argue is I've been talking for 15 years about a 3% per year energy efficiency rate, and it hasn't happened. So I don't see people. Like, there's a lot of banks that offer energy efficiency loans to customers. I don't see people queuing outside of banks to get those loans. So the attractiveness of this current measure is clearly not quite there, right? And if you think of it, that shouldn't be surprising, because what is an energy efficiency renovation is someone coming to your house and saying, I'm going to disrupt you. I'm going to make your life a bit more unhappy for a few weeks while we do these measures. In the past, I wasn't promising you savings. I couldn't guarantee you that the savings were really there. And even if they are there, they're going to pay you back over a long period of time, by which you might have sold the house or changed your lifestyle or moved on, right? That is not a incredibly attractive offer compared to maybe a solar offer, where we saw lots of take up, which came and said, we're going to disturb you in a limited way. We can promise you exactly what you're going to save. You'll see it on your meter. If we don't deliver it, you'll know. And the payback is going to be sub 10 years. And I think, it's the market is the market. If this was going to happen by itself, to a large extent, it would be happening. So we could talk about it, but if we're going to get 3% per year and get to 2050 and deal with climate change like we know that we need to, then governments, I think, are going to have to think of some new models. And all that we're saying is this technology allows us to change the way we look at it and think about different types of policy instruments that have worked in other areas. The policy instruments aren't new.
No, but the thing that worked with solar, or the thing that drove people to install solar panels on their leaf, was quite generous tax incentive tax concessions in order to do it. And at one point, government started cutting back on those, and so it leads me to the question, Peter, if you want to come on this, is financing, is this as much a financing issue as a regulatory issue, or probably both?
Yeah.
Where's the balance, and how much EU money should be going into renovation? Or
I think that finance is one of the key parts there's no doubt about that. There are other barriers than finance, as
I was going to ask about that too. Sure. Yeah.
And therefore, because finance is needed, you need to think about sources of finance, because let's be honest, public money is always scarce. It is now, and it will always be.
And it'll even more so in the future, I think.
Exactly. Yeah. If the economy goes less quickly, then tax revenues fall and things like that. So some of the mechanisms we have discussed and mentioned today, like energy taxes and the emissions trading system that auctions a good share of allowances, those generate money for governments, and that money can be used for good purpose. What we're looking for is not grants to be made to already fortunate property owners. What we're trying to do is to save occupants of buildings money that outflows every month for their energy bills. And often that needs pre-financing, but it eventually will pay itself back. I think we need more availability of that sort of finance that will make the things happen that can happen, incentivize people to actually undergo the inconvenience of a renovation, but which are not inordinately expensive. And subsidies often are. But what we need the subsidy to do is to scale things up in order to bring down the costs. Then the subsidies should be, of course, withdrawn as one would expect, and as has happened in the renewable space.
We're in the last 8 minutes of the webinar, so let's take some more questions from the audience, assuming we have some. I think we do.
Have many. We have many.
We have a lot. Should I stay on the financing, or can we jump to the scalability, for example?
Well, one thing. There's one question I can read from somebody disagreeing with me that buildings should be put into the emissions trading scheme, and saying it's unworkable. And it's a reminder that it took 20 years for the emissions trading system to have an effect. I would say no, it didn't take 20 years. The emissions trading system, as we discussed last time, has delivered a bigger reduction than any other of the sectors in the effort sharing regulation. So it is delivering, and there is a mistaken belief that it doesn't work. It does. And it also generates revenues that in some cases member states are using to finance the retrofitting of social housing. So I would contest that particular claim, but of course you can discuss whether or not energy taxation is the preferred instrument, or emissions trading systems, or some other obligation on householders. But we have to think about how much these different measures cost, whether they're affordable in the long term for governments, and insofar as both taxes and the emissions trading systems apply the polluter pays principle, those who pollute more are paying more, and there's some social justice in that.
Let's come back to Barry, because you're the opposite. You're an anti-polluter, or you're a depolluter, or whatever. So, I'm just going to give you a nice softball question as we get towards the end. But what incentives do you want to see, or what sort of regulatory framework? What do you want to see in the Green Deal that's not there, or not there strongly enough? Because there's talk about an open platform, but these are cooperative instruments, and if that's what we rely on, it may never the renovation wave may never happen. So what would you like to see?
So I think there's been conversations about, for example, a clear renovation target, which I think would be a starting point. Getting member states they're really focused on renovation and what that really means. I don't think that will by itself translate into renovation happening. I think, as I've said several times, I think Europe has to look at either Europe as the Van der Leyen Commission or as individual member states have to look at creating the capacity, the companies who will actually deliver these huge projects. And I think the way to do that is to look at some flagship initiatives like we've done in other sectors and ask how can we actually get this industry up and running from the beginning, and to look at, encourage member states to look at alternatives like feed out tariffs or other ways of really getting this going. And to the cost question, I would also remind ourselves that the climate change is going to happen because it's a just transition, because we're going to bring along the people who will not necessarily benefit from the beginning from some of this work, right? And I think energy efficiency, we should remember energy efficiency renovation has a lot of positives on that side, right? Again, as I said at the beginning, 92% of firms are less than 10 people. So you're putting money down into the bottom part of society who pretty much always spend what they have, right? So that money goes back into the economy and generates jobs and growth even more. You know that a large part of the cost of a renovation are taxes, right? VAT taxes, employment taxes on the workers. We have a high employment part. We know that most material producers are European based, right? So the factories are based in Europe. So that, again, that money circulates back in the European economy, creating more taxes and more revenues. And the one thing that doesn't tend to stay in the European Union is energy, right? Energy tends, when we buy energy, we're buying it usually from third countries, and that money is flowing out of our economy and not coming back in. So I think from that macroeconomics perspective, the question of cost is there. And I think the other thing to say is energy efficiency already starts at a much more cost-effective position than renewables did at the beginning, right? We're not at 45, 50 cents a kilowatt hour like renewables started in some countries, right? We're already down much, much lower. So I think that the beginning of the curve, and we still have to drive it lower over time, which I think those types of approaches will do. But actually, I think if you look at that kind of macro position and the need to get the economy restarted, because I think that's the other question. I mean, yes, there will be resource constraints, but the European Union and member states coming out of this crisis are going to intervene in the economy in a way that they've never done before. It's not a question whether they're going to shape the economy, it's how they're going to shape the economy now, right? It's not a question if, it's just how. And what we're saying is they have to shift it towards an acceleration of climate mitigation. They have to get out there and use this as an opportunity to move, whilst securing a just transition and supporting people. They have to think about the new major players of tomorrow. Who's going to deliver these things that are necessary, and how do we get there? And that's the conversation that we'd like to have with government about this.
Okay, maybe we're into the last 3 minutes of the talk. Maybe let's just look at the final poll results while we're there, and then maybe we have a minute or so for an extra question.
Yes, so I published the results of how should renovation be given a bigger push. 46% of the audience thinks that targets such as renovation rates or energy efficiency improvement, this is the way. 25% thinks public funding, and 12% that we should include them into ETS.
Okay, great. We have 2 minutes left. I don't know if there are any questions. Oh, Peter, go on.
Well, yeah. Just on the question, I know these questions are obviously very simplified, but the question would then be, if targets is to be pursued, on whom are targets put? At the moment, we have a very, very high level on the European Union level. We have targets, but it's not a renovation target. Would it be national governance? Would it be, who exactly would you make an obligation for? Maybe the energy providers and such like, but it's the question that needs answering.
Quick comment there, Barry. Oh, yeah, quick comment, Barry.
Yeah, so I think you need to start and then accelerate, right? So I think in the beginning you would look at all your obligations at the member state level to hit a renovation rate. Some countries have logically looked at things like you can't rent property if it's below a certain energy efficiency level. That's been based obviously on a certification because that's what exists today. But you could look at real performance for that as well. But you can start, as countries have said, you start sometimes with the public sector, move to the commercial sector, and then move to the private rental sector. Some European governments have looked at that at the private residential. And I suppose, again, at some point, I don't think that's for me to say, but I think there is a point between government and society to say, actually, if climate change is so important, there is a point at some time in the future where there may be a group of people who just haven't used the incentives and the support mechanisms to get there, which, yeah, maybe there'll have to be obligations on people at the very end of the process. But I think that's not the conversation for today. The conversation today is how do we get started? Like,
okay,
how do we get
right.
this role?
Okay, sorry to cut you off, Barry, but we have reached the end of the webinar. Just a quick little bit of housekeeping. So thank you to the speakers today. Please sign up for next Tuesday's, the next webinar. Yeah, look forward to speaking to you soon. Thanks, everybody. Bye now.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.